Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Bonnie Lowenthal. I'm a commissioner for the Port of Long Beach, and I'm delighted that the president of the Port of Long Beach, Tracy Agoscu, is here with me as well. And this morning, it's my honor to introduce to you Captain Alberto De Ruiz, who crafted the very first master plan for the Port of Long Beach. He was born in 1853 in Havana, Cuba, and he went on to become the first Latino graduate from the Annapolis Naval Academy. He trained as an engineer in the U.S. Navy and sailed to ports around the world. Following his military career, Captain De Ruiz spent some time in San Francisco and Stockton, and then, lucky for us, he finally came to Long Beach to work in the city engineer's office, which must have been very tiny at that time. But he is considered to be one of the primary architects for the Port of Long Beach because he drew up a plan to dredge about 800 acres of swampy coastland. Today we go to the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C. and have their help in dredging. But that project was funded by taxpayer-approved bonds and ultimately allowed ships to safely navigate our harbor. About a year after retiring from the city, Alberto De Ruiz died from a heart attack in 1922 at the age of 69. And the Port of Long Beach continues to evolve as we move forward with an ongoing review of a master plan that builds on his vision. Along with guiding development and land uses around the harbor, the master plan permits us to advance environmentally friendly policies and technologies that will continue green growth at the Port of Long Beach. Now, you already heard about the opportunity to get a copy of the Port Town book. But I did want to tell you one more thing, the reason I'm holding this hat. This is a hat that is sometimes worn by the dock workers at the port. You can see there's a hook on this hat. And in the early days of the port, that's what the longshore people used to lift up the boxes and packages that came in on the ships. Well, today, you know what you see. You see big cranes lifting the containers. And there are still thousands of dock workers that are very important labor jobs for this region, and hopefully that will continue. So now I would like to introduce Captain Alberto De Ruiz.
Bienvenidos. I am Captain Carlos Alberto Jose de Jesus, de Ruiz, y Barot, de San Maurice. In 1875, I was the first Latino to graduate from the United States Naval Academy. My father was Cubano, and my mother was born in New York. They both came from wealthy families, from old money, old Caribbean money. They settled easily into New York. They were married in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. They lived in New York, but had houses in Pennsylvania and in Cuba. And that is where I was born, in 1853. Cuban freedom fighters have been fighting a war for independence against our Spanish colonizers. And that meant tension and unrest. So they moved the family to New York. And that is where I grew up. And my father and I became U.S. citizens. My family's reputation led President Grant to appoint me to Annapolis. I trained in engineering and served aboard ships that sailed around the world. That experience served me well the rest of my life. I was stationed at Mare Island near San Francisco when I retired at 32. I worked in the Bay Area for a while and then moved to Stockton. It was a great place for engineers, particularly those interested in waterways. While in the Navy, I'd gotten married, and we had a son named Richard. It turns out a son was not enough to keep us together. We divorced, and I returned to New York alone. While there, I met a woman named Elizabeth. We were married, and we had a daughter. We named her Pauline, after my mother. Southern California was growing and had plenty of opportunity for civil engineers. In 1907, I got a job as a draftsman in the city engineer's office. As I looked towards the Pacific from my office window, I could see the municipal pier and the pike at the end of the trolley line. Towards San Pedro, I could see all of the bustling activity at the port that Los Angeles was building with the support of the federal government. Between that harbor and my office were 800 swampy acres, where a changing cast of companies were determined to build their own port. Long Beach was still a small town, and with the Los Angeles port already in progress, this seemed a bit silly. It wasn't a uniformly shallow swamp. There were deeper channels and areas where the land rose above the waterline at low tide. Still, the year before I arrived, the port got its first significant endorsement and tenant when John Craig agreed to move his shipbuilding plant from Toledo, all of his equipment and all of his employees, from Toledo on Lake Erie to Long Beach. City boosters gave him 40 of their swampy acres, and he dredged a channel from his new shipyard site to the open ocean. His company dredged more channels, and other tenants bought land and moved in. Soon, the city built a municipal wharf so that visiting ships could load and unload goods. With the wharf, the city was no longer just a watchful bystander. It had a stake in the port's development. In 1914, the Panama Canal opened, and shipping lanes between the east and west coasts of the United States became more efficient and less expensive. 1914 was also the year of the Great War, or, as you call it, World War I. It brought the rapid rise of Japan as a military power and as a receptive market for American goods of every description, from steel to lumber and citrus. The Los Angeles River separated downtown Long Beach from the new port, and it emptied into the swamp. This didn't seem to be a problem, as the river was just a trickle most of the time. Today, it is a cement-lined channel you probably call the flood control. 1914 was one of those rare years where the sky opened up and flooded Southern California. The usually anemic river swelled to a torrent that overflowed all along its course. The flooding caused $10 million worth of damage. To its credit, the 1914 floods led Los Angeles County to establish the Flood Control District. Planners looked for problems up and down the river with the goal of creating solutions. Unfortunately, preliminary planning wouldn't help when 1916 brought another year of torrential rains. The thick, chunky stew of mud, silt, and rocks came down the river and filled in the channels the Craigs and others worked so hard to create. Ships in the harbor were trapped. City boosters, still eager to make the port a success, asked Long Beach for help. City leaders considered bonds to pay for more dredging, but that would take a vote of the citizens. The ships needed to get into the Pacific immediately. The city spent $3,500 to open a temporary channel. With the problem temporarily solved, ships in the harbor sailed out, and the election for bonds and a longer-term solution was planned. Many in Long Beach thought the city should pay for dredging. Others argued that the former swamplands didn't belong to the city. It belongs to the port's private owners. It wasn't something the city could spend money on to improve. Cora Morgan, a woman that could always be counted on for rabble-rousing, said that if the city owned the port, she and her friends would support the bonds. But since it could be argued that the port was owned by private parties, she and her friends sued to stop the bond election. That is where the city called upon my expertise. With nearly 15 years in the Navy, I'd seen my share of ports. My work in Stockton had given me valuable experience in the areas of water engineering and land rights. I was the right person to find the answers to the questions and issues at hand. I studied maps, ownership documents, and court decisions. I issued a report stating that small pieces of the land in the 800-acre swamp belonged to the city. Along the shoreline, the territory between the high and low water lines are called tidelands. In 1911, the state gave its tidelands to the city. That meant Long Beach was in control of the waterways in the new harbor. The law also said that the land in the waterways could only belong to the government. In other words, Long Beach owned the land at the bottom of the channels, along with the silt, mud, rocks, and boulders that washed into the area with the floods. Cora Morgan lost her court case and the war of public opinion. The bonds passed, and the city began to dredge the channels. Today, I am going to tell you something I probably shouldn't. Despite my role in establishing ownership of the swamp, I had my doubts. I questioned the wisdom of building a port so close to the mouth of a river that went from a trickle to a torrent in rainy years. The federal government showed no inclination of helping Long Beach build its port. It barely wanted to help Los Angeles. And LA's idea of helping was to insist we turn our port over to them. That wasn't going to be my problem, though. In 1916, I left the city engineer's office. Submarines were becoming increasingly important for the Navy during the Great War. A partner and I had planned to build submarine chaser boats and hoped to win government contracts. Fortunately for everyone, well, except us, the war ended before we could begin operations. I returned to the city engineer's office, where I worked until I retired in 1921. I went to the engineering firm of Wills and Collins, anticipating a future filled with challenging projects, including a long-term strategy for the port. In May of 1922, an unexpected heart attack ruined my plans, and, well, here I am. I am sorry I wasn't alive when the Army Corps of Engineers actually relocated that troublesome river mouth away from the port. That silt was still a problem for someone, but it wasn't the port. It is clear my doubts about the port were unfounded. Today, the Port of Long Beach is one of the world's busiest seaports, a leading gateway for trade between the United States and Asia. It supports over 1 million jobs nationally and generates billions of dollars in economic activity each year. And, just like in 1921, it is building a strategic plan for its future. I am happy to see that its dedication to the future has not waned. I was privileged to be a part of its creation. But thank you for stopping by to hear my story. And I hope the next time you buy your next phone or car, you think of me and the port that I helped build.